Welcome to Military Wife, Life and Strife, the podcast where we get open and honest about all the struggles of military life. And welcome to the community that has your back, no matter what. Come get real about the strife with me, your host, a military wife. My name is Heather, and today I want to get real with you about this podcast. I want to introduce myself, give you a little bit of background on me and why I've started this podcast. We will get a little deep in this episode. I promise I won't always be this intense, but we will touch, just a trigger warning, we're going to touch on the subject of suicide. But I am all about diving into the hard conversations, and that's one reason why I'm doing this podcast. I will get into that later. First, let me tell you a little bit about me. I am a military wife, hence the title of the podcast. But I do want to say this podcast is not just for military wives. I named it that just because I'm the host and I'm a military wife. But this is really for anyone, military, non-military, anyone that wants to hear military stories. That's all it is. But I named it and it's catchy, so I liked it. Military Wife, Life and Strife. So my husband is in the US Army. He has been in for 13 years and we've been married for 13 years. So our entire marriage has been in this military life. However, neither of us actually grew up in a military family. I actually didn't even grow up in the United States. I grew up in Scotland. I was born there, moved to the US when I was 16. So that explains the slight accent you might be hearing. Or maybe you didn't hear the accent at all until I said Scotland. And then you're like, oh, that's what it is. That's what I'm hearing. So it's this weird mix of an accent, half and half. It's not quite American, not quite Scottish. But there you go. But in case you did not know, the Scottish are known for their storytelling. It is a big part of the culture. Historically, a Scottish clan would have a member of the clan who is designated as a storyteller, or they call them the keeper of the memories. And the Gaelic word for this is Seanchaidh. I don't really have a Scottish enough accent to pull off the Gaelic, but it's called a Seanchaidh. So that's what I will be for you all. I will be the Scottish storyteller, the Seanchaidh, but for military stories. This podcast, it's going to be a way to tell people's stories and also use that part of my cultural background. And the reason I think it's important to share stories because it just makes us feel less alone. When we hear other stories, we are able to connect with them and build a community because military life is hard. So my goal here is to create a community where we can talk about all the hard stuff. We can encourage each other. We can share the burdens, the good, the bad, and the ugly of military life. From my own experience with deployments and geographical separation and solo parenting and impending war and many other military trials, and then also my own anxiety and mental health struggles, it has been people and community and connection that gets me through it. This podcast has been a long time coming, but I didn't really know the reason behind it or the purpose, that like storytelling purpose. When I first thought of this, I just was like, I'm going to start a podcast. I don't know what it's going to be about. And so I sat on the idea for years, not just kind of figuring out what I really wanted to share, why I had this desire to start a podcast. And it wasn't until there was a very serious event last month. At the base that we're at, there was a National Guard unit that was training. One of the soldiers put a bullet in his temple. He was rushed to the hospital, but he died a few days later. I didn't know him. I don't even know his name. All I know is he left behind a pregnant wife, and I could not get this soldier out of my head. I'm not an expert in this, but I kept thinking how heavy his burdens must have felt to think that the only way out was to take his own life. Whatever burdens he was carrying, I don't know what it was, but he was probably holding on to it all by himself. And it's too much to carry all by yourself. It's too much to do alone. This life is hard. And this military life is especially hard. There's stuff that we go through that probably doesn't really exist in the civilian world, but life in general is hard. And I realized that there are so many people walking around with these very heavy burdens. And yet, hearing different stories makes us feel like we're not quite so alone. We feel a bit more connected when we realize other people are going through the same or similar things that we are. So my goal here is to create a community where we can share stories, listen to each other, encourage one another, and not feel so alone. I know that personally, I just feel better when I talk to people. There's two specific moments from this past year that kind of helped shape that thought. One of them was I was sitting with some friends. We were at some kids' event, and one of the moms there, she has 4 boys and her husband is deployed, and she is just so chill and just seems like she has it all together. And someone asked her, basically asking her how she does it. And she specifically asked about bedtime. She was like, how do you do bedtime? What does bedtime look like in your house? And she goes, a lot of yelling. And it felt like a burden had been lifted off of me. I was like, really? I'm not the only one that yells at her kids at bedtime. And it just made me feel lighter. It didn't make bedtime go easier, but I just felt not so alone in that tiny little struggle in my life. And then another moment was when a friend called me. She just needed to talk. She needed to vent, and she called and was going on. And then she kept apologizing for that. And I was like, this does not make me feel heavier. That's the other thing. Like, if you have burdens that you need to just get off your chest, it doesn't make me feel heavier sharing them with me. I might be alone in this, but I want you to tell me. I want you to share your burdens. Tell me your stories. I will listen. I will pray for you or with you. If you want, I will give you advice, or we can just chat and I will just listen. And we will feel lighter at the end of the conversation. This isn't a podcast where I want to just complain about military strife or vent, just to vent about it. You can do that on any of your military-based Facebook pages, I know. But I want this to be a safe place to share stories, encourage one another, be honest and vulnerable, and just not feel alone in the very real strife of military life. Now, I touched on a very serious topic, and I want to go back and address that really quick. I was so deeply affected by the soldier who took his own life, and I didn't even know him. I was so emotional about it and didn't even know his name. But I know that there's a lot of you out there that know someone who died by suicide. In fact, there's way too many of you out there that probably know someone who died by suicide. And maybe they've been on your mind as you've been listening, so I want to ask you all to do something. For those of you that know someone, especially a veteran, if you know a veteran that took their own life, I want you to write their name in the comments. Whether you're watching this on YouTube or on Instagram, write their name in the comments. If you are just listening to this podcast, go to YouTube and write their name in the comments. I feel like it is important to remember them. I want to have a chance for you guys to honor them and recognize the struggle that they went through. If you want, you can share a memory. But I also, on the other side, I want anyone out there who maybe is struggling, maybe having ideations of suicide, I want you to look at all the names that are written in the comments. But I want you to pay attention to the person writing the name. That person represents someone who cared about them. And I want you to realize, if you are struggling, there are people out there that care about you, probably a lot more than you realize. So if you are struggling with heavy burdens, you do not have to do it alone. You don't have to carry it all by yourself. I will share a few resources in the show notes that you can use, but also don't discount the value of a phone call with a friend. Send them a text, call them, send them some smoke signals, something that you just to connect with them so that you can talk. I promise you, you will not inconvenience your friends and family by reaching out to them. They would rather hear from you than about you. I'll say that again. They'd rather hear from you than about you. And again, I found through my experience, I feel lighter after talking to friends, but I don't feel heavier when they share their burdens with me. The issues after they talk to me or I talk to them, the issues might still exist, but sharing it just makes the burden feel lighter because you're not going through it all alone. And so here's what I want you guys to go do. Again, as you've been listening, there may be someone on your mind that you're like, man, they really need to hear this. Share the episode with them or go text them, call them. Just let them know that you are thinking of them. And then subscribe to this podcast so that you can follow this storyteller, your military Seanchaidh. What I hope to share with you all is interviews with people from lots of different perspectives of military life. People who have been through hard things and can encourage you now from the other side of that. I will also do some solo episodes and I'll have some story times at the end of those to share any stories that you send me. So go follow me on Instagram, send me your stories and tell me what you want to hear about or tell me who you would like for me to interview. Subscribe to this podcast to continue hearing military stories told by your military Seanchaidh. With that, I am done. Thank you for listening to me today. I am so grateful for all of you. This is Heather signing off. I'll catch you guys next time.